Morning, everyone. Just for a moment, think about the people who have had the most influence on you, on your values and on your view of the world. You might include your parents or your spouse, your kids, or perhaps some inspirational friends or figures in your life. Many of you might include Jesus, but perhaps few of us would think of the people who wrote the Bible, like Paul, Luke, John, Moses, and the many writers of the Old Testament books. If you call yourself a Christian, you may have been influenced more by these writers than you realise. Of course, there is the central idea of all these people that wrote the Bible, different parts of the Bible, that they were writing the Bible under the inspiration of God. But nevertheless, much of what we read in the Bible is shaped by the people who wrote and translated it. One of the reasons for this box set on Paul is because of the extent that his letters have shaped Christian doctrine and practice for the last 20 centuries. And it's fair to say that probably no one other than Jesus has had more influence on the structure, the ethics, and the philosophy of Christian church than Paul. 2,000 years on, Paul's writings still primarily influence social structures such as gender, sexuality, family, and slavery, as well as the leadership and the structures of churches. Many people base their moral and ethical code on Paul's writings. But there are risks to taking some of Paul's words written 20 centuries ago at face value and applying them to our own lives and society without careful contextualization. This practice has led to the use of Paul's letters to justify slavery, the subjugation of women, and the condemnation of homosexuality over the last 20 centuries. With such huge personal and social consequences at stake, it is simply not right to apply Paul's letters without working hard to understand what he really meant. And that means doing a bit of history, which I admit is not everyone's cup of tea. But bear with me, because it really is essential to understand the Bible well. So with that in mind, let's talk about Corinth, because we know that Paul wrote at least 3 letters to the Corinthians, 2 of which are actually in the Bible. Now, as it happens, 3 weeks ago, my family and I were in ancient Corinth, surrounded by souvenir shops with books on Paul and rows and rows and rows of plaster of Paris statues of Greek gods with various appendages. Now, if you've ever met a famous person, you might agree with me that they always seem smaller and less impressive in life than you imagine them to be. Well, the word Corinthian has been with me ever since I attended Sunday school in the village Methodist church, like 40 years ago. So to actually be in Corinth, I felt quite exciting. But not surprisingly, it was smaller than I imagined, and that was not helped by the fact that ancient Corinth has been excavated from the soil and most of the buildings are lying in pieces on the ground. However, the excellent museum helped us understand what a fabulously significant city Corinth once was. By the time that Paul arrived in Corinth, the city had already been in existence for 800 years. The Romans had conquered the city and then rebuilt it during the reign of Julius Caesar and made it their regional headquarters. It occupied a narrow piece of land between mainland Greece and the Peloponnese Peninsula. And it had 2 ports, Lechium on the Gulf of Corinth and Cenchreae on the Aegean Sea. Now, if you wanted to travel between Rome and anywhere in the eastern half of the Roman Empire, you either had a treacherous sea journey around the Peloponnese and risking the storms, or you took the shorter and less risky journey through Corinth. So you would unload your boat at Lechium, your goods and your boat would have been hauled the short 4 or 5 miles distance to the Aegean port of Cenchreae, where you would have re-embarked to continue your journey to the places in the Eastern Empire. Since 1893, boats have been able to travel through the amazing 4-mile Corinth Canal between the two seas, and others have been able to bungee jump from the bridge that bridges over the canal. All this has meant that Corinth was a bit like London's Heathrow Airport, a global hub for the many of the world's travellers. And like London, Corinth became very wealthy, with merchants buying and selling commodities, shipbuilding, hotels, banks, insurers, and customs taxation. This map shows what Corinth would have looked like, with colonnaded shopping malls to rival Cribbs Causeway, theatres, banks, courts, civic offices, pubs, restaurants, luxury shops, and incredible homes, or at least the Greco-Roman version anyway. Excavations have revealed statues of Caesar, full sets of Corinthian currency, mosaics, elaborate pottery, toys, and home furnishings. Excavations have also revealed many temples and shrines to Greek gods like Apollo, who was the god of music, light, and the arts, Aphrodite, the goddess of love, Tyche, the goddess of fortune, and Poseidon, the god of the sea. It shouldn't surprise us, therefore, that Paul writes in his first letter, 1 Corinthians 8, 5-6, "For even if there are so-called gods, whether in heaven or on earth, as indeed there are many gods and many lords," Paul says, "yet for us there is but one God," clearly reflecting his observation of the many gods in Corinth. See, Corinth's position on the main east-west route between Rome and Jerusalem, its important status in the Roman Empire in Paul's time, and its cosmopolitan citizens are of special significance in understanding Paul's letters to the Corinthians. You see, in AD 49, the Roman Emperor Claudius expelled the sizable population of Jews from Rome, and this enforced migration meant that many of these wealthy Jews ended up settling in Corinth. Now, if you have a Bible, turn with me to Acts 18, and we're going to read about Paul's interaction with the people in Corinth. After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. There he met a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, which is northeastern Turkey, who had come recently from Italy with his wife Priscilla because Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. So here we have Luke, who wrote this account we call Acts, inserting a verifiable historical event into his narrative. And we know from the Roman historian Suetonius that Claudius did expel the Jews from Rome because riots were occurring between Jews who accepted Jesus as the Messiah and those who didn't. At that time, the Roman authorities didn't recognize this split within Judaism, but make no mistake, this was a big split, and the disagreement between the two groups was passionate and often violent. There have been so many religious splits throughout human history. Take, for example, in 1054 AD, Christianity split into Western Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. In 632, Islam split into Sunni and Shia after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. The split within Judaism, between those who accepted Jesus as the Messiah and those who didn't, was on this order of scale. Jewish rabbis described the Jesus Jews as Nazarenes in order to make clear that they were not, in their opinion, proper Jews, and they named them Nazarenes after Jesus, who himself was from Nazareth. So, if you call yourself a Christian, note two things. One, you are part of a sect, a movement that emerged from a major split in Judaism. And two, you could justifiably call yourself a Nazarene instead of Christian. It's common to think that Paul is singularly responsible for the spread of Christianity throughout the Roman Empire, but it is clear that there were many Jews living in Rome who were already accepting that Jesus was the Messiah, well before Paul ever made contact with them. And here, Paul meets Aquila and Priscilla, two of the Jews who have been expelled from Rome by Claudius. Paul went to see them, and because he was a tent maker, as they were, he stayed and he worked with them, it says in verse 3. Tent making was a skilled craft that referred not just to making tents, but anything made of leather, clothes, bags, household items. So Aquila and Priscilla invited Paul to join their business and lodge with them. Shout out to all the entrepreneurs out there and all the bivocational pastors as well, church planters. They would have occupied a workshop in Corinth in one of the colonnaded shopping malls with plenty of time to talk as they worked with their hands, making things out of leather. Verse 4, every Sabbath, Paul reasoned in the synagogue, trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. When Silas and Timothy came from Macedonia, Paul devoted himself exclusively to preaching and to testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Messiah. Now, if you're familiar with Paul, you will remember that he felt especially called to make the gospel of Jesus known to the Gentiles. See Acts 9 and chapter 22 for examples of this. However, Paul was also passionate and called to persuade the Jews that Jesus was the Jewish Messiah. And when his friends Timothy and Silas turn up, they free him up to devote himself fully to that process and that activity. But the anger and the violence that caused the Jews to be kicked out of Rome resurface here in Corinth as well. And Paul is right at the centre of it. Verse 6, when they opposed Paul and he became abusive, he shook out his clothes in protest and said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads. I am innocent of it. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles." Verse 7, then Paul left the synagogue and went next door to the house of Titus Justus, a worshipper of God. Crispus, the synagogue leader, and his entire household believed in the Lord. And many of the Corinthians who heard Paul believed, and they were baptized. Wow. Paul angrily storms out of the synagogue, angrily promising to never try and persuade the Corinthian Jews that Jesus is the Messiah again, goes next door, no doubt followed by the synagogue leader in hot pursuit, who says, hang on, I am persuaded by your argument about Jesus. Although Paul was a feisty character, the constant conflict with his fellow Jews was clearly taking an emotional toll on him, so much so that Luke records a vision that Paul must have told him about. Verse 9, one night the Lord spoke to Paul in a vision, "Do not be afraid. Keep on speaking. Do not be silent, for I am with you, and no one is going to attack or harm you because I have many people in this city." Paul is clearly encouraged by this dream and decides to stay in Corinth for 18 months. And throughout this time, Paul was clearly at the centre of this split in Judaism, so much so that the Jews who did not accept Jesus as the Messiah took him to court. The judge is the Roman governor Gallio, born in Spain, and the brother of the Roman historian Seneca. This is actually one of the most accurate dating of Paul and his letters. So verse 12, when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews of Corinth made a united attack on Paul and brought him to the place of judgment. That's the courtroom. This man, they charged, is persuading the people to worship God in ways contrary to the law. Just as Paul was about to speak, Gallio said to them, "If you Jews were making a complaint about some misdemeanor or serious crime, well, that would be reasonable for me to listen to you. But since it involves questions about words and names and your own law, that is your own religious law, settle the matter yourselves. I will not be judge of such things." So he drove them off. Gallio's disregard for the Jewish sensitivities added fuel to the fire and incited right there and then another riot in the middle of the courtroom. These were really feisty times. Verse 18, Paul stayed on in Corinth for some time, and then he left the brothers and sisters and sailed for Syria, accompanied by Priscilla and Aquila. Before he sailed, he had his hair cut off at Cenchreae because of a vow that he'd taken. They arrived at Ephesus, where Paul left Priscilla and Aquila. He himself went to the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. He's back there. When they asked him to spend more time with them, he declined. But as he left, he promised, "I will come back if it's God's will." Then he set sail from Ephesus. And when he landed at Caesarea, he went up to Jerusalem and greeted the church. And then he went down to Antioch. The vow here that Paul had taken, the Nazirite vow, was a vow in which he consecrated himself for a period of time, abstaining from food and drink derived from grapes, and letting his hair grow. This was whilst he was in Corinth. And so the reason he cut his hair off was to cancel that vow as he goes on his journey to Jerusalem, most likely to go and celebrate the Jewish Passover. And here's the thing I want us to grasp here. Although Paul is now regarded as one of the founders of the Christian church, he was a Jew through and through. His opponents wanted to paint him as a Jewish heretic, but he refused to be boxed in by them. In his mind, his conviction was that Jesus was the Jewish Messiah, and that made him even more Jewish than those Jews who didn't accept Jesus as the Messiah, hence his Nazirite vow and his participation in the Passover. Paul's insistence that Jesus was the Jewish Messiah drove a wedge through the heart of Judaism and contributed to the division of Judaism into those who accepted Jesus as the Messiah and those who didn't. Paul was labelled a Jewish heretic, and if he'd had a Twitter account, well, he would have been trolled, abused and attacked on a daily basis. Thanks to Luke, we have this insight into Paul's time in Corinth, and without that, it would have been harder to understand the backdrop to the two letters that are recorded in the Bible that Paul wrote to the Corinthians. His first letter to the Corinthians, that Chris Simmons presented brilliantly, I might add, in episode 8, tackled some of the factions and the division amongst the Jews and the Gentiles in Corinth. But it appears that many of the Corinthians were unhappy with Paul's first letter and rebelled against his leadership. So, we learn that Paul had followed up in person with what he calls a second painful visit in 2 Corinthians 2:1. And after that visit, he wrote a letter that's not in the Bible that he says was written with anguish and tears. Check out 2 Corinthians 2 verse 3 and 4. So after all these measures, most of the Corinthians seem to realize their part in this conflict and apologize to Paul. And he follows up with a third letter that we rather confusingly call 2 Corinthians. Paul was clearly a polarizing figure like Marmite. You either loved him or probably hated him. And this was true before his Damascus Road experience as a Pharisee, and was true afterwards as well. Those who hated him picked him apart, finding as many faults as they could, comparing him with other more impressive Jewish leaders whom Paul sarcastically calls the super apostles in 2 Corinthians 11 verse 5. In chapter 3, he responds to an apparent demand from the Corinthians for letters of recommendation to prove his authority and his credentials in their community. But this seems ridiculous to Paul. The Corinthian church wouldn't even exist if he hadn't started it. So he says that they are proof of his genuine leadership. They themselves are his letters of recommendation. It appears rather that Paul is not the impressive leader that the wealthy Corinthian Jews want him to be. He's puny, he's portrayed as puny, poor, homeless, victimized and ridiculed, and compares poorly with the impressive, wealthy and successful Jewish leaders in Corinth. So how does Paul deal with the constant criticism and opposition that followed him through his life? Well, he makes a virtue out of his weaknesses. Instead of trying hard to cover up his weaknesses and pretend that he is something that he isn't, he's honest about them. In chapter 2, Paul depicts himself and the other apostles as captive slaves to King Jesus, drawing attention to Jesus rather than to themselves. He turns the idea of success upside down, and in chapters 4 to 7 he explains how Jesus' glory was revealed through his suffering and his death on the cross. Comparing himself to an ordinary earthenware jar, in chapter 4 verse 7 he says, "But we have treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us." For Paul, nothing is more important than Jesus being revealed to the Corinthians. And if his weaknesses allow this, then all the better. In chapter 10, of 2 Corinthians, at risk of drawing attention to himself, Paul says, do these super apostles really want to compare themselves to me? Are they Jewish Bible experts? Paul's a Pharisee, for goodness sake, one of the best educated Jews of his time. Are they experts on Jesus? Paul has had visions and experiences of Jesus that have transformed his life, turned him upside down. But more importantly, Paul says he has worked harder, been in prison more frequently, been flogged more severely, and been exposed to death again and again for the sake of Jesus. Although Paul is clearly embarrassed about boasting about his credentials, he says in 12, verse 9 and 10, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Wow. Paul really was a remarkable person. A strict Pharisaical Jew whose life is turned upside down by Jesus. He had many faults and many reasons to dislike him, but no one could fault his passion for Jesus and his conviction that Jesus was the Messiah, not just for the Jews, but for every single person who's ever lived. I wonder how much we have been influenced by Paul. Here's some questions you might want to ask yourself. How have your values and your opinions been shaped by your understanding of Paul's letters? Have you taken any of Paul's words at face value and not understood the context in which they were written? Which parts of Paul's writings confuse you? And are you unable to reconcile with your day-to-day life? Let's pray. Jesus, thank you so much for Paul and for his influence on our lives and for his influence on billions of people across the world. But please would you help us to understand Paul's letters in the context in which they were written, so that we can better embrace the life-giving wisdom contained in these letters in our own lives and in our communities. Would you give us the courage to challenge our assumptions and the curiosity to dig deeper, to understand how our allegiance to Jesus, to our allegiance to you, can bring us life and life to our communities. Amen.